Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that everyone is having a wonderful Sunday so far. Welcome back to another episode of the Sunday stream. And yes, we do have a lecture for you this week. So no delays, no AMAs or anything. Thankfully, my schedule cleared up and we have something for you all. So let me just go let everyone know that we are live and we'll be able to get started shortly and things are going well. I'm seeing plenty of familiar names and faces in the chat. Hello, everybody. So let me go notify everyone that we are live. I love scheduled tweets for this purpose, but you got to do it on every other platform. So here we go. And that's taken care of. Live now. Fantastic. Alrighty, cool. So welcome, everybody. Let's go over what we're going to talk about today because there's plenty of things to discuss. And I think what this is going to be is one of those streams where it's going to be a part one of many. Because when it comes to a subject, of course, like the internet, there's so many things to talk about. There are so many experts that we can look at, and those who work in computer science and programming that we could probably learn a lot from them. So this is going to be what I think is a very good introductory aspect into some of the international relations behind the internet, especially now in 2022. And I think that in the backdrop of what's happening in Ukraine and all of the video footage that we see out of there, that what a better time to have this discussion. So we're going to talk about the internet today, and that's our area of discussion. So let's get started. So an outline for today's discussion is going to be sort of the progenitors to the internet, because a lot of this, of course, comes from the United States, and then its rise to what we know it as the commercial life. Because I feel like it's important that if we don't start at least with the history, then what good are we really going to be doing? From there, we'll transition. We'll start talking about internet governance and agencies and what role that these institutions play. Some of them, of course, are intergovernmental, various international as well as state-owned of these. So from there, we'll talk about the debate over national control over local access and how that plays in contrast to these international institutions or intergovernmental organizations. And then we'll talk about, of course, data, information distribution, narratives, and then, of course, everyone's favorite part in the year 2022, hacking, psyops, and these kind of applications. And then we'll, of course, again, take questions throughout because you guys always provide a good discussion. And then we'll go to announcements and Frog of the Week. We do have a rather special one this time for you all. So I hope everyone's Sunday is going incredibly well. Today was the Sunday of St. John of the Ladder for us, and I hope that everyone is doing great no matter where you are. So let's begin. Of course, the internet is of not anything without, of course, its progenitor, that of Arpanet, coming out of the United States. And so, for those of you who don't know, I mean, Arpanet from the advanced, what would become DARPA, right? About advanced research programs. And this, of course, was the idea of how does the United States, and of course, in the wake of Sputnik and in the wake of nuclear weapons, that how do we continue to communicate as a government, and how do we manage to maintain effective command and control over armed forces and populations in the wake of a nuclear attack, especially at the time when the space race was at its highest. And this was already after a mass mobilization, whether it's the National Defense Education Act, or now more recently with the idea of maintaining government and control communication after nuclear war. So this really begins to kick off in the 1960s, but I think it's important that we name some of the seminal thinkers and workers that sort of got this idea going off, particularly like that of J.C.R. Licklider and Bob Taylor. These gentlemen had worked on a variety of things, whether it was Bob Taylor's concept of the man-computer symbiosis back in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and then, of course, JCR was already sort of working within the government. He worked within the Information Processing Techniques Office, the IPTO, about how to better process and access information for government institutions. So all of this worked within the Department of Defense. And then, of course, Donald Davies, for those who probably work in computer science or work online, probably best know him as the internet pioneer known for packet switching as a way to discuss, how to bring about information. So the funding for this project officially begins in 1966, but this is after about a decade of discussions, white papers, theoretical concepts. And it's in 1966, and this is where we get into sort of this debate about defense versus communications, is that they managed to secure $1 million from the Ballistic Missile Defense Fund within ARPA in 1966. And this is when the project really begins with some of these gentlemen right at the helm. And this is a map, as you can see on the right, sort of the logical map from 1977. So this project had been going on now for over 11 years by this time being mapped out. But initially, there were 4 immediate networks or nodes for this to begin, the most prominent one being a supercomputer in Los Angeles. And these universities, of course, being the largest centers that house these kind of computers, because, of course, back then, computers are the size, if not larger, than the space that would take up a mattress or a gun safe. So this was a great way to have communication between all of these large institutions throughout the United States that housed such computers and to communicate and process information. Now, this really begins to take off in 1973 after certain communication protocols are put in place and sort of your earliest forms of email are developed in the 1970s. So this is when things really begin to take off. And as you can tell by this map, it put itself out there. But between those that actually worked on the project and some of those who were in charge, you sort of have your classic, the civilian versus defense rivalry, when the same kind of rivalry that we've seen in the United States when it comes to control over nuclear weapons and and that kind of technology. So, as you famously know, back in the 1960s, there was a very famous sort of internal power struggle within the United States government that went on into the 70s in regards to civilian versus defensive control over America's nuclear arsenal and nuclear materials. I believe to this day, a lot of the nuclear oversight still is within the realms of a civilian hand, which is the Department of Energy. But inside, in regards to Arpanet, and what would eventually become the internet, is the issue here uh, is of course, the sort of the suits versus the eggheads claim. So by that, you have your sort of civilian, your engineer type saying that, this is a great way to enhance the communication and the computing resources of educational universities that house supercomputing technology in the United States. Whereas, of course, the defense position about the founding of ARPANET has always been explicitly about the way to maintain communication and information networks in wake of a nuclear attack, to maintain command, control, and ways to organize information across the United States if that were to ever happen, and a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States. And of course, as we know, ARPANET eventually fades out as the technology is then exported towards the commercial market. And around 1990 or so is when it really begins to shut down. But I feel like we can't really begin to talk about, sort of the international relations and geopolitics of the internet if we don't start at its humble beginnings here in the United States. So this is the primary history. And of course, it is decommissioned officially in December of 1990, especially as laws are put in place from the U.S. Congress, various forms of the Telecommunication Act that gets passed in 1990. You have the famous Gore Bill of the same time, which begins to officiate government and commercial agreements on how to manage and produce that technology commercially. So it's decommissioned in 1990, and from there, the internet, as we know it, really starts to begin to take off from the last 30 some odd years. So the internet today, I know I'm about to skip maybe 30 years of internet history, and I feel like it would be remiss of me not to mention things like Usenet or what people call, Web 1.0 and such, which is why I think that there's so much to talk about, that this will probably be a subject that we revisit in the future, because Lord knows that we could talk about the history of the internet, various early forms of viruses, various forms of hacking and whatnot, whether it's the I love you or various other forms of that kind of technology that have been evolved in the early aughts and late 90s. So, but one of the things that I think is very important for us to talk about, however, is sort of the governance things. So I wanted to start with this quote from, I believe her name is Sarah Jane Terp. She is, I believe, a professor at Northwestern University. She's contributed to, I believe, the Brookings Institute. And I will say with important clarity now, she has written and is a member of the Atlantic Council. But I think what she says here, regardless of her affiliations, is still very true when talking about the internet in the very early years, when it comes to at least international relations. Where she had said that nobody who dealt with large-scale governance models had expected the internet to become this important, which I'm sure is very true when we consider the fact that one of my favorite headlines that I like to use to talk about someone like Paul Krugman of the New York Times. This gentleman has a Nobel Prize in economics, for goodness sake. But anyways, his famous headline about the internet will one day go the way of the fax machine into either irrelevance or just something that we use all the time. So I would firmly believe that, yes, there was an expert class that had no idea what would come from the internet in the early days of what it would mean. And there are plenty of other agencies out there that still help govern. There are numerous societies. There's the Internet Governance Society, the Open Internet Society, numerous others that we can talk about. But I think that, as we've seen now in the last 30 years, that this would rapidly evolve, and the ability to put out information, but also how do you maintain control over these institutions as well. And which brings me, of course, to ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. This is one of the most important institutions on Earth that maintains and controls things for assigning names and numbers, and a record and list of, I believe, all domain names in the world for how that works in the internet as we know today. Their official mission, of course, is to help secure a stable, secure, and unified global internet. It is an American multi-stakeholder group and nonprofit organization. Multi-stakeholder meaning that it is not just explicitly American. Although it is based in America, it has a majority of its employees based in the United States. They are headquartered in Los Angeles. They've got about 400 employees last I checked. ICANN was formed in 1998, and it coordinates these, identifiers that, of course, for websites across the world. Every website has an address, of course, and it's meant to promote competition and develop policy for the internet's unique identifiers. So this is in things that go over the domain name system, DNS, ways in which we, identify these things through an IP address. So all of these things are part of governance within ICANN. And the United States is sort of famously given ICANN more control, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But ICANN plays one of the most important roles when it comes to the internet to this day. And there's a lot that is important for us to talk about. But of course, this also clashes with the geopolitical reality that a lot of nation states face in the 21st century. So, there was a very excellent article by The Hill 2 weeks ago. I'm going to try and look up the author's name because it was just a very fantastic read, and I'm going to link it in the description afterwards. But he was describing how a lot of nations that view their territorial sovereignty and their military capacity in sort of that, great game sense is very 18th, 17th century, as well as 19th century nation state thinking that now has to be applied into the 21st century. No one can talk about the geopolitics of the internet, he writes, without considering that there is a 1,000-mile strip from Seattle to San Diego that houses most of America's infrastructure to the internet and the United States. Not to mention the fact that the internet was originally founded in the United States as a way to survive nuclear attack. And since then, of course, it has gone all over the world. And it is the Hill's article about the geopolitics of the internet, I believe. I'm going to go make sure I give that credit. Yeah, Geopolitics and the Internet from the Hill. And this is from Roger J. Coscetti. He wrote this just last month on the 19th. And of course, to put things into perspective, the internet has roughly 4.5 billion users. Roughly 6% of them are American. About 250 million people in the US are on the internet. Almost 18, 19% are Chinese. Europe constitutes about 9%, around 400 million. And then, Russia is about 2% of the internet's global users at 100 million. Japan and Brazil are also within those numbers. So the internet provides a unique way to not only control your own access over the internet, who can see what kind of controls do we have in place, things that have been in the United States relatively open, although the discussion over clear web versus dark web prompts a very interesting conversation, and that could be set up for a stream at a later time, because that, of course, does have a place in the world of geopolitics. However, for the purposes of today, we're not going to dive too much into that. We will, though, in the future. These great powers, of course, do have their own desires to have the internet used the way that it does. And how we've always talked about it on this channel and how we've looked at other writers, when we look at the idea of what's labeled liberal hegemony, for instance, you have the concept that nation states under liberal hegemony are going to be safer because if other nations hold the same sort of values, the ideas of having open democratic elections with a head of state that views themselves primarily in the lens of a nation state, i.e. a government, and they promote things like free trade and private enterprise, then odds are that they're not necessarily going to be a threat to you. Now, we can, of course, probably many of you here are going to have some disagreements with that, and that's perfectly fine. I have disagreements with that. We've talked about that numerous times on our channel, whether I'm reviewing Barry Posen's Restraint or we're talking about forms of realism. However, since we know that this is one of the modus operandi of the current grand strategy of the United States, we know that this applies to the internet as well. That if you can have a free and open and democratic internet, then you don't necessarily have to worry about what your rivals are doing, because you might have access to what they're doing or what people are posting about, what kind of data you can extract from that. So, in terms of internet history of geopolitics, there were, of course, closed networks that existed in Europe in the late 80s, early 90s, which eventually would give way to the more open internet that we're so conveniently using right now and today. But this does have its roots in Europe long before the internet was created. We do know, for instance, that a lot of aspects of the United States and its internet policy and its grand strategy in Europe had always been rivaled by sort of the American skeptic trying to divest away from its interests of the United States through the time of de Gaulle. And we can see this whether it's through American pressure with the European community, the empty chair crisis, this sort of question of whether functionalist states can operate, and, of course, the general skepticism that came from some European leaders after the Marshall Plan. Now, that time of the internet has passed, obviously, and the time of that skepticism, however, is somewhat returning, but the internet, of course, is still free and open because most of Western Europe adheres to these, liberal ideas and these egalitarian values. However, in the 21st century, we do know that that has definitely changed. We know that China, for instance, has chosen a different path. It rapidly developed, of course, during the 21st century after substantial economic growth in the 1980s and primarily in the 1990s and the 21st century in the first decade. We know this from it being, first primary favored nation status with the World Trade Organization in the 1990s, and that status has become permanent. We can look through that famous GIF that we've discussed, I think, is far back when we talked about hegemonic stability theory. That famous GIF about first primary trading partner between the United States and China from 1988 to 2018. So we do know that the internet, of course, within China is vastly different than what we see in the United States, and we'll discuss more about it later. But we do know that because things are more closed, that there is significant suspicion from this state because they don't have as much access to what's being discussed, and they don't have access over control of data or the flow of information. We know that nations or American companies like Google have bent the knee to Chinese interests because we know that the idea of having 1.2 billion consumers on the internet is far too lucrative to pass up on. Now, China, of course, has made it clear that they want to expand their internet services and technologies around the globe. I believe in 2020, there was a lot of discussion about what China wants to do with a digital Silk Road. This was, of course, a part of their Belt and Road initiative, and this was put out in I want to say 2014, 2015 Chinese white paper. These are things that, of course, do get published. I know that Xi Jinping always puts out, I think, every 4 years or so when he's put in as president again about Chinese governance. But they want to have a digital Belt and Road for telecommunications, data-related business operations, and point of sales for companies within the Belt and Road. So areas that we've talked about on this channel are areas of significant interest for China and this internet form of governance. Specifically, if you have control over the technology and how network is and that information is distributed on a network, then you probably have more leverage over those who don't. And we do know that between sub-Saharan Africa and South America, that the billions of dollars that have been invested primarily in telecommunications and infrastructure has seen substantial investment in these countries, primarily with using Chinese technologies and Chinese firms, which has been one of the battle lines that has been drawn over technology. And who has access to that technology? What kind of technology am I buying to use for my own resources? Because I do not want to risk it being compromised. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But these geopolitical realities, of course, exist because in the 21st century, not only is it about territory, not only is it about strength, not only is it about deterrence, but as we saw from the 20th century, you give me the photos and I'll furnish the war, as William Randolph Hearst might say. It's a lot easier to do that now on the internet when things can be taken out of context, digitally altered or created. And now, here we are. And we'll talk about Ukraine, especially towards the end. And, of course, there are other institutions. For instance, there is the ITU, which is the United Nations equivalent of having governance over the European or over the internet and its affairs. So, with the internet, this is the International Telecommunications Union. Originally, this was something funded or originally came back as the International Telegraph Union back in the 1860s, long before the United Nations, but it was absorbed in for communication and information technologies under the UN several years later. But it is part of the United Nations. And as we've talked about on this channel, and as I'm sure as you've noticed when it comes to the United Nations, that it is the sort of the battleground of the world politics, because the United Nations, and while not always do their resolutions mean anything, and not always will the Security Council go the way that some nations intend because of veto powers, it does give you a good sign of where nations are heading and where nations are going. We talked about it on this channel as well when we looked at the United Nations General Assembly condemnation vote of what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, and how there were 35 notable abstentions, primarily that of the BRIC countries, and recognizing that people know where their bread is buttered. India knows that it gets weapons from Russia. India knows that it can benefit from the economic relationship in the midst of these sanctions. Right now, they're buying oil at $35 a barrel. And South Africa receives a substantial amount of agricultural products and industrial machinery and petroleum from Russia. And I would imagine that the internet, of course, will play a role in this in the future as well. And whether that leads to fragmentation of the internet, but there's a reason why the ITU plays such an important role here versus ICANN. And we'll talk about that in the coming slides. So now that we're addressing some other things, surveillance, of course, being prominently one of the most important ones, and international concerns that come with that. There's a big wall of text. I promise it's not a lefty meme, but it's an important statement from 2013, almost 10 years ago now, that I think is definitely worth discussing. Finishing my coffee before it gets cold here. So, of course, as we know, around 2013, courtesy of Mr. Edward Snowden, and sort of what brings Glenn Greenwald to international fame is, of course, the NSA, National Security Agency surveillance and information leaks that became very much aware of sort of the global war on terror, spying apparatus, the fact that the American government had been spying on Dilma Rousseff in Brazil at the time, who was president. We had been spying on Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany, and it was a significant diplomatic issue for the United States at this time. And what had led to that was something known as the Montevideo Convention in 2013, where the leaders of various organizations across the globe, this was not just Western backlash, but it was international, all over the world, outside of the United States, sort of turning their back to sort of the American-led form and model of internet governance, thinking that that's a way for them to be spied on. Which, in retrospect and in hindsight, right, my mind kind of immediately thinks, well, duh, right? Any great power would try and utilize their technology in order for spying. But if you'll permit me, I'm going to read a little on the right, if you can't. So this was the statement that came out of this convention. Leaders of organizations responsible for coordination of the internet technical infrastructure globally have met in Montevideo, Uruguay, to consider current issues affecting the future of the internet. The internet and the World Wide Web has brought major benefits in social and economic development worldwide. Both have been built and governed in the public interest through unique mechanisms of global, multi-stakeholder internet cooperation, which have been intrinsic to their success. Leaders discuss the clear need to continually strengthen and evolve these mechanisms in truly substantial ways to be able to address the emerging issues faced by the stakeholders in the internet. In this sense, and these are the four major takeaways from this convention, they reinforced the importance of globally coherent internet operations and warned against internet fragmentation at a national level. They expressed strong concern over undermining of trust and confidence of internet users globally due to recent revelations of pervasive monitoring and surveillance. So you can already see sort of the American aspect there. They identified the need for ongoing efforts to address internet governance challenges and agreed to catalyze community-wide efforts towards the evolution in global cooperation. And then the last two are talking about accelerating the globalization of ICANN and IANA functions towards an environment in which all stakeholders, including all governments, can participate on equal footing. Now, keep in mind, at the present moment, ICANN kind of plays this very special role with the United States. And we'll be talking about it very soon. But the IANA, of course, is the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. It is a standards organization. It is a organization that oversees global IP address allegations, helps with the domain naming system, media types, various protocols, and it was originally founded by the United States in the 1980s, and again also located in Los Angeles, California. So that 1,000-mile strip from Seattle to LA, kind of rearing its ugly head up again. But they want to globalize it. They want to have less direct American control, which they kind of get around 2016. We'll be talking about that shortly. But of course, nations that possess these programs are always going to operate them. We know that the United States does it. We know that we have the great and infamous Five Eyes agreement between other Anglospheric countries. We know that Israel has its own capabilities, Russia, China, and various other powers as well. But in response to not just the United States, the U.S. has done this in response to other countries, more recently with that of China, because that, again, great power rivalry kind of happening here. So there is Section 889 of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2019. And let's see here. The National Defense Authorization Act of 2019 is like all NDAAs. It is for a budgetary law that sort of operates what the national defense is going to be about, what gets funded, what policies are being put forth from the Congress. And it's specifically, of course, right about certain technologies from China not being allowed to be bought by federal entities or entities that are contracted by the federal government. So if you are someone that purchases from the federal government on behalf of the federal government, doesn't matter if you work as a park ranger or you work for the NSA, none of you are allowed to purchase technologies from Huawei, ZTE, I think like Solaric Media or something like that. But ZTE and Huawei being some of the largest. So, of course, things like WeChat and TikTok are not allowed on United States bases. All of these things during the Trump administration, these rules are still in place even now, post-Trump in 2022. But it's not just other nations turning their back on the U.S. It's also, of course, the United States acting in response. And I see that Skeptical Waves is also in chat. So I'm very glad because I'm sure he knows a lot more than I do, and I might want to bring him on one of these days. But again, international institutions or local control, and how much local control should there be over that kind of governance? So, as we mentioned earlier, right, the supplanting of local closed networks for international and global access happens around the 1990s as the internet proliferates to what it is. And I'm sure that there are some of you in chat that are old enough to remember in the United States those lovely CDs that you might be able to purchase or get for free with certain purchases of serial, like 500 minutes of the internet via AOL. And making sure that nobody was on the phone when you decided to engage in your dial-up connection, which I'm sure sounded like something that you could hear at a nightclub now in 2022. But so those closed networks, in the West primarily change. And as we had discussed, other countries, of course, still have closed network systems. The United States still possesses a closed access network system for specifically its military and the ability to respond to outcoming threats. But since we're talking about ICANN and we're talking about the United States and that wonderful stretch of 1,000 miles on the U.S. West Coast, in 2016, this all did change. We did have originally the National Telecommunications and Information Agency, the NTIA. This was from the United States, founded in 1978, located in Washington, D.C. And around 2016, after years of beginning to cede technology, or a lot of its governance and control over the internet, at least within the United States, NTIA had ceded some control to ICANN. And many were very concerned that this was going to be a problem. There was a lot of debate about it when it happened under the Obama administration and the waning years of it. But this, of course, started at the very beginning of his administration. On September 30th of 2009, the NTIA, on behalf of the U.S. Department of Commerce, had reached an agreement with ICANN on an affirmation of commitments that completed the transition of technical coordination of the DNS to a multi-stakeholder, private sector-led model that contains certain provisions to ensure accountability and security. And also as well transparency, with the goal of protecting the interests of global internet users, as well as mechanisms to address the security, stability, and the resiliency of internet DNS. And this officially became real in 2016. For those of you who may remember, this was met with a lot of concern back and forth about whether or not this was going to affect American security or whether it would not. However, there were many on the right at the time, even mainstream Republicans, saying that this was a bad idea to let this go to sort of a multi-stakeholder model. However, many had claimed on the left, there's a many of article I remember from the New Republic at the time, talking about how giving it to ICANN was a lot better option than, say, having it under the purview of, say, the ITU and the UN, which would be far more likely to meet security concerns that were being addressed by the right at the time. But of course, when all of this had started with the NTIA and the development of the internet, there were concerns, of course, as early as the late 1990s, saying that this was in violation of the Constitution, that it violated various aspects of the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and that the executive authority of the United States had no such power to regulate or contain this. Many lawsuits at the time happened in the very early days of the internet. But, of course, control was eventually ceded over in the waning years of the Obama administration in his second term. Domestic regulations and technologies, of course, still exist. As I mentioned earlier, there are still closed access networks for the United States in terms of its military. The military has its own closed sort of response tool to help deal with any potential attacks from the outside on government emails and primarily the military. That's been around as long as as long as Arpanet's really been around. But what I have on the right is a book that I actually own. It's always nice when I get to reference things that I read years ago. So this is called the Great Firewall of China from James Griffiths. This is a pretty good book actually because he wrote this knowing people that worked in the system. And yeah, he wrote it in 2019. Yeah, so this is like one of the last books that I remember really reading like in depth because I was still helping people out with doing speech and debate and stuff because I was still in El Paso. But the Great Firewall of China, Griffiths James does a really good job talking about how it works, how online businesses thrive inside there, primarily state-operated enterprises from the Chinese government, and how dissent is easily quashed, and how the Chinese Communist Party has been managing to keep out any sort of attempted globalization, and how to make sure that Western companies play by their rules rather than sort of the open processes that they know. So there's something deeply that I enjoy there about the fact that it works. And the book's full title, of course, talks about how to build and control an alternate internet, an alternative version of the internet. That's the whole title of the book. And the argues that the Chinese model not only is a way to have more authoritarian control over governments, but also provides an case study in real time as to what an alternate version of the internet would look like under state control, under government control, and not sort of the free and open access that we have now. So these things definitely do exist. And China, of course, is the most publicly well known. Although we do know in various other parts of the world that the ability to shut down the internet has existed quite clearly. Specifically during the time of trying to oust Hosni Mubarak in Egypt in 2013. And of course, Turkey during the alleged coup attempt of President Erdogan in 2015 had also seen closures and cessation of services of the internet. And they've also seen it more recently as well during anti-government protests. But in this day and age, and I think Lowell brings up an interesting question, and I'm going to bring it up in chat because I think that this is something that we could definitely talk about, is all these liberal terms now must be questioned. Is open a good thing? Is resilience real or just a cover? While I am not a technical expert, and I think that I'm going to have to return back to the subject when I have those people on, especially someone maybe like Skeptical Waves, who probably knows a lot more than I do in regards to computing. But it does pose an interesting question because we do know that, the United States has surveillance. We know that the question of metadata is a real thing. We know that sort of our managerial system in the United States, right, operates under, ESG. The idea of, environmental and social governance, things that investors are applying into non-financial factors. Almost every company sort of takes a look at that and, talks about how it's important to have these factors in here, equity and inclusion and being resilient and diverse. So it poses an interesting question. But the internet, of course, as we know it, has seen evolution. Whether it's, though, I have a lovely gentleman in my Telegram chat who just goes by the name B, who always talks about getting on Urbit, or of course, as I mentioned earlier, that sort of clear web, dark web distinction, Tor browsing and whatnot. So I mean, the internet has the capacity to evolve, but of course, many aspects of open multi-stakeholder governance, as we talked about earlier, does pose the interesting question. Does open internet play into sort of the game of liberal hegemony? And as we talked about earlier, yeah. To me, it seems that way. Yes, we are. The more open things can be, the more likely that you can just say whatever you want. I know that a lot of people like to thankfully Schizo post about that idea of LifeLog from DARPA and the CIA project compared to Facebook, how that closes the same day Facebook opens. I mean, if it's all open and we're all just voluntarily giving everything out there, yeah, I would imagine that's the case. So there's definitely something to have in consideration to that question, Lowell. Melphis999 asking, like, why the heck are 2/3 of all the reactionaries like Charles all computer nerds? Melphis, if it makes you feel any better, I'm not a computer nerd. I would like to talk to them a little more about this issue because I think it's a neat overlap and intersection between what I know, international relations, and what they know. But I think someone answered your question quite clearly. Pattern recognition and autism will do a very good job at that. So yeah, but some people are also talking about like shortwave radios and whatnot. I mean, that's also incredibly regulated by the federal government. If you want to go back to the ham radio days, you still have to get it registered and whatnot. So that technology is older than the internet. So of course it's going to have more regulations to it. But Zach M says it best, and we should know this from here on out. When the product is free, it really means that you are the product. And yes, and we're going to talk about that in just a second here, because there's a lot to discuss when it comes to the issue of data. Because there's a great website, I think, where you can just look up if China's blocked something. Things about Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Because again, you do not want to have access to American surveillance programs like PRISM and others that we know from that time. One of the most famous ones that didn't get a lot of discussion that I know was leaked was one called sexual intelligence, that one's particular habits and proclivities online could be used as potential blackmail against political figures across the globe. So that's something to keep in mind. Gents, there's a reason why we tell you to stop looking at porn and all that jazz. There's your answer. Because our good boys at the feds are definitely taking notes of what evil stuff you're looking into. So keep that in mind, and we'll carry on. So since we were talking about if you are operating a free product, and that just simply means that you are the customer, then here we go. Who owns what? Data in the 21st century. Of course, these concerns have always been an issue over consumer protection and their consumer data, and more specifically metadata, about who has control over that, whether it's defense officials or privacy advocates, mainly consumer privacy advocates. But state-operated enterprises like China, of course, definitely keep track of this data and information. And in the United States, it's sort of an oxymoron to talk about private institutions or private companies, because what is a private company anymore when the feds are all in your business, primarily with taxation, but also because you have these rules to abide by. Silicon Valley, at this point, I think just has as many lawyers as they do, startup tech guys, because you need to play by all of the rules in order to make sure you're going with what you're doing. But again, metadata about the file name, the author, the date, where it was, its location, geography, taking all of this data in mind of what you're looking at and what you've downloaded and what you purchased. And it's easy to get a really accurate profile of what a person is. This sort of stuff is what we see about targeted advertisements of where you've been, what you've talked about. There's the lovely little meme about how you're talking to somebody in person with one conversation, and then you pull out your phone, and there's suddenly targeted advertisements about whatever you were discussing. This has happened to me when I'm talking about looking at like a mobile home or a new car. I've gotten advertisements for that before. So again, it's an issue for both those who are concerned about their privacy, the civil libertarian side, which is a side that I don't think we should be ignoring politically, and then of course defense officials. So in 2020, prior to Trump being ousted from office, one of the big areas that he was trying to focus on via executive order was that of the issue of TikTok, originally known as Musical.ly by some. And the executive branch in the United States has two avenues in which it can sort of control things like applications that you can download onto your phone. So there are two, and he uses one of them, but we'll talk about that. You can see the lovely acronyms down below on the slide there. So the first one you have is the CFIUS, which is the Committee on Emergency. It's the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States. And that, of course, is an interagency institution between the executive and the Congress and the Department of and the Chamber. The Department of Defense, the executive branch, right? The Congress, and then I also believe those that work in the Commerce Department. So this great interagency group in which the executive has the authority to basically say, no, we're not going to have this. We consider this to be a threat. So, and then of course the second one, and this is the one that Trump actually used to push his TikTok ban by executive order, was called IEEPA. I'm just going to call it EPA, which was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and this is what he used to ban TikTok. And we know throughout the entirety of the Trump administration, his foreign policy towards China was trying to divest and reshore and put in some economic distance between the two, are all very real things that were smart foreign policy. Whether it was his thinking or someone else's, I don't know. But again, another thing that I don't mind, because again, there are a lot of people that have TikTok on their phone, and I hope none of you in chat have it, because again, it's a state-operated enterprise. He's trying to ban WeChat and TikTok, and the companies that actually own them, which again, state-operated enterprises, SOEs, and he was pushing for their removal. Didn't want them in the United States. And again, all of these concerns are very real in the world of geopolitics, because if people have your data, if people have your information, all of those things are to be in place there. And I know a lot of people are already talking about radio in the chat, and I think Sean has an interesting thing here. He says, another good aspect of getting into amateur radio is it's a Renaissance man hobby. You can also learn about meteorology, astronomy, engineering, and most importantly, you build communities. Well, now, Sean, I'm now thinking about doing that. We can have like a radio show, fireside chats in the United States. But yes, hopefully no normies here. So again, this allows us to sort of move down and talk about these things, whether it's about public-private partnerships, surveillance capitalism, ESG. Because again, the question, right, always remains is if the product is free, then you are the product. You are providing information all out there, and to do so. So things to keep in mind is that we aren't the first country to do this either. India had banned TikTok as well, primarily also for the reasons similar to ours about data. And of course, because it's 1.2 billion people on China's borders that they don't have necessarily the world's greatest relationship with, but that's improved over the years between border agreements and China operating to negotiate when there comes to disputes between Pakistan and India in the past. So, but they've banned it in the past as well. And Visigoth in the chat points out, apparently, and someone hopefully do confirm, they've also gone pretty deep in the adoption of GNU/Linux because they really dislike Bill Gates, apparently. Well, Visigoth, if you know anything about what Mr. Gates has been operating under in regards to certain medical research in India, you might understand why they don't like Bill Gates. But yes. And while we talk about environmental, social, and governance, as well as the sort of public-private thing in the United States, because almost all aspects of the internet in the U.S. has some relation to the DoD, it has some relation to the executive authority. And for us, geopolitically, our information is readily available and it's readily targeted, whether by our own government, of course, but at the same time, we also know that they were trying to push forward, and all of that information goes around and it's studied on us. The reason why we know, for instance, that domestic surveillance happens by private institutions happens from Amazon. They track the demographic data and what people talk about inside their Whole Food stores, and they try and make them as diverse as possible because we know that diversification in these stores decreases the likelihood of unionization. Now, we can talk about unions all you want. I think that AA has an excellent video on the problems that unions have from an economic basis. But if they want to organize, and I think that you can call this my bad normie take here, but if they want to organize against Amazon that owns Whole Foods, I think they have the right to. And that's what they keep that kind of data, and they track that. They also track what you're saying on your social media. That's why now on every job interview that you go for, you have to be careful about what you say on social media. Helps to have a veil of anonymity, even though it doesn't really exist. But I know that since we talked about the TikTok sale, I need to make sure that didn't actually go through, because there was talk about to Microsoft, but I don't think that actually happened. Yeah, September 28th, 2021. Microsoft says the failed TikTok acquisition was the strangest thing. So it actually um, didn't happen. So no, it didn't go through, I believe. The proposed deal was under the pressure of the administration, which is why they called it the strangest thing. But yeah. But no one highlights sort of my opinion as well. I hate them in practice. I like them in theory, which is why they don't they don't work. Which is again why I hold AA's position. I like them in theory. I like the concept, but no, didn't happen. So, but in the realm of domestic stuff, the domestic foreign policy begins at home, right? So we know in an age long before the internet about the FBI's counterintelligence operations. We do know about various forms of surveillance on domestic citizens. I think there was a great conversation that Semiagog had in a private chat, and I hope he doesn't mind if I just bring this up. But he just casually one day sort of looked into the open records of the CIA and typed in, his last name, and he had found that his father was somehow on that list by just random association. So that's where you're at, and that's how we are, which tells you a lot about how what happens at home is exported abroad, because typically in the U.S. we're the guinea pigs for that foreign policy. However, internet governance has changed in terms of us moving things away from the NTIA into ICANN. And before I get into hacking and cyber attacks, I do want to let you all know, though, that for the United States, we do have a lot of our control and a lot of our sort of defense and securitization of the internet, primarily for things like I have on screen, hacking and cyber attacks, oh my, comes under the CISA, which was made during the Trump administration. It is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency to help defend the United States against cyber attacks and the loss of personal information from American citizens. It is a relatively new organization. So, yes. And I see that Scrump is in chat. Hello, Scrump. Good to see that you're here. But yes, we do have the CISA. It's been around since 2018. But now on to sort of the big fun topic that I wanted to bring up, along with sort of the PSYOP and narrative thing. So hacking and cyber attacks, cyber warfare continues to evolve through state and non-state entities. Although I think what's been clearly known by a lot is that when we talk about non-state entities, there's usually some sort of correlation between state governments. I think that there's almost this digital privateering kind of way. While there's no real direct confirmation, a lot of people like to accuse the hacking group Anonymous. Although if there is documentation saying that there is, then hey, so be it. That Anonymous sort of works for the State Department or works for the feds. Then if that's the case, then that doesn't surprise me. The internet is also the application of proxy conflict geopolitically the same way that we would on the ground. Especially, for instance, like, oh, we fund the YPG in Syria. All these groups in northern or northwestern and northeastern Syria that are primarily of Kurdish descent to go fight in Syria that also gets attacked by the Turks. But there's always those degrees of separation, so it's not directly implicating you, or at least that it doesn't lead back to you in the chaos and the fog of war. So, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if organizations like Are Evil or that of Anonymous are part of sort of the digital high seas of privateering. But the most famous one, I think that many people kind of know about, was Stuxnet and Operation Olympic Games. So this happened during the Bush administration. It was also talked about during the Obama years. And this was an attempt to cripple Iranian infrastructure, primarily at centrifuges for nuclear weapons. And there were reports later on, I believe in the last few years, saying that this was actually just a small part of a much larger operation. So this was long before the Iranian nuclear agreement. And it was meant to primarily target Simeon's technology in order to disrupt the technology that they had, in order to preserve or stop, Iran's nuclear weapons program. And of course, I have the little steps here on the right about how Stuxnet would just enter a system via USB stick and proceed to infect any machines running Microsoft Windows by brandishing a digital certificate that seems to show it coming from a reliable company. And that worm is able to evade automated detection systems. And it, of course, would search for targeted industrial systems by simians. And if it didn't, run on that computer, didn't have any simians, didn't work there, it would just download more versions of itself and, just be out there. But if it manages to find something with simians control and access the internet, and again, the internet, then of course that worm compromises those target systems and their controllers by exploiting zero-day vulnerabilities, software weaknesses that haven't been identified by security experts. And this allows them to control, deceive, and destroy. And this was used very famously by the Israelis and the Americans to disrupt Iran's nuclear weapons program. Now, of course, how much of this is still being put into use? Who knows? Keep in mind that this administration is trying to bring back to life the JCPOA, the joint agreement about the Iran nuclear deal, although Iran is not very likely to hold on to it. And if there's one thing that we've learned from the Trump administration, is that American foreign policy can change administration to administration. That despite leaders advocating when Trump got elected in Europe that it's for 4 years, America will still be here, that attitude has significantly changed. So, just one small part of a larger operation, and it's what we've seen here in the world of digital privateering. It's one just small part of a much larger world. One of the biggest things that we talk about in this day and age is, of course, the issue of ransomware. And ransomware has gone up significantly, especially during the COVID years. A lot of consumer analysts say that it's primarily due to a lot of people working from home. I do think that that's partially true. But if everyone's working from home and people aren't on the ground at their offices or not dealing with the equipment that could be potentially targeted, like we saw last year in 2021 when Biden took office over the pipelines in the United States, then that's a bit concerning. So some actual records here. This was from Fortune magazine. Ransomware in 2021 saw a 1,885% increase from 2020. So it's a bit intense. And also that same time, healthcare industry specifically saw a 755% increase in ransomware attacks. I think the most well-known one was JBS USA. They were a meat packaging, and they handled the shipments of meat in the United States. They paid a whopping $11 million in order to ensure that their operations could resume. So something like that is definitely very real and very time. So things to keep in mind in that aspect, and they're only going to continue. And in fact, the Council of Foreign Relations, which we can all roll our eyes at because we kind of know their background and past. Keith Woods did a very good video on it, but they are a very good bean counter if you can ignore the spin. They had talked about one of the biggest issues that ransomware attacks do have is the ability to slow systems and not only target personal data, but also at the same time clog up the supply chains in a very vulnerable system as well. So these things are very, very real. The infrastructure behind the internet is a very vulnerable place, especially to the layman. Just to give you a bit of an anecdote, with me, like that's the biggest thing that my company will always send emails about at least 2 or 3 times a day about people sending in reports for phishing or ransomware attacks and how they're responding to it and why it's important to be responsive and attentive in doing so. Because if there is one thing that is definitely true, I think it's the last 2 years has made us a little lazy to the internet. We're so accustomed to it in the West about purchasing things online, putting our information in, having regular people. I would imagine that you're all a little more vigilant, but people storing their information on Google or having their Apple Pay or not thinking twice when using their card and what it's connected to. So all of those things are definitely very real. So, all of this stuff is incredibly important to consider in the future. And then this stuff will continue to evolve, whether it's people asking for Bitcoin or asking for them to do something in order for information and data to not be released. But we also see this explicitly from state actors. We do know that a few years back that the entire sort of government list of employees was hacked and leaked. That information was primarily made available by the Chinese. And I'm now trying to remember exactly what it was that was talked about, whether it was the it's going to escape me now, but I mean, hacking is definitely a substantial issue when it comes to both the government and others. In fact, a few years ago, or earlier, last year, there was a cybersecurity chief of the United States who had resigned, saying that we're years behind the Chinese. So things to keep in mind. So not so sure now, as Guy from V says. So yeah, there's all sorts of stuff. And Mr. D is here. One of my favorite people. Hello, Mr. D. But again, this is the reason why I wanted to talk about this was in the wake of what we are seeing now in 2022, and specifically what's been going on now for over a month in Ukraine. Social media, narratives, and trusted sources. So there's always been the concern of state interference and misinformation, both at home and abroad, that affects governments and regular people alike. It's always fun when you all sort of see that Pepe Silva meme about trying to connect the dots between things and such, which of course is what we've been trying to do. And it's also the main reason why I haven't been covering the war in Ukraine day by day, is that I don't want to cover things that are misinformation or propaganda or whatnot that'll be debunked in 6 hours, or told that it's digitally altered or whatnot. And we see this a lot, both at home and abroad. In the 2020 election, we do famously know that the one use of a, what's the word I'm looking for? A deep fake was that they digitally altered the location of a sign where the then candidate Biden was speaking at. And, he said one thing. He said hello to one state when the banner behind him said another, but we know that that wasn't true. So a lot of these things are things to keep in mind. And on the right, as you can see, your image. The image from the Arma 3 official Twitter account. Dear Arma community, beware that lately quite a few videos from heavily modded Arma games have surfaced, tagged as videos depicting the current Ukrainian conflict. We are in touch with media to help fact-check such videos. And we've seen this about Arma. We've seen this with War Thunder, and we've seen this with Digital Combat Simulator, trying to aid the argument about the ghost of Kiev, or what the war on the ground looks like to show off what's going down on there. So the war on Ukraine has been the most prominent example to date, with edited footage, video game footage. We know that ASB military definitely had an issue where even their real footage that they were showing had shown, people fighting in apartment buildings, and now that they're being attacked, that's why they're no longer on Twitter. They're kind of showing that, people are kind of doing the Palestinian thing, and that's why they're targeting these civilian infrastructure. Or most famously, right, we had Congressman Adam Kinzinger, the Republican that voted to impeach Donald Trump, famously retweet the Sam Hyde Goes to Kiev meme, which then, of course, got made fun of by Tucker Carlson. So we do live in a world of the hyper-real. It's a memetic kind of conflict. And these things play a major role. As I mentioned earlier on the stream, we talk about the issue of, I'll furnish the pictures, you furnish me the war, as William Randolph Hearst of the newspapers would say. And now, the same thing can be done online. We've got Zach M says, we have to catch these doctors out there doctoring these images. Might be known with a hacker known as 4chan. They can't keep getting away with it. And no, they cannot. But the other thing that I thought in mind, actually, in the past, was the issue also when it came to the coronavirus. And I will be very careful with what I say here, because I still am on YouTube. Thank you, Susan. And we know at the beginning, for instance, Reddit, in the opening weeks of this pandemic, had given a lot of articles reaching to the top of our news and world news and politics, talking about the issue of, China hid information from the press. China didn't talk about what it was currently fighting. China didn't talk about the issue of X in regards to the pandemic. And then somewhere around the end of March, the media changes and it starts going towards the domestic side. It's about Trump. It's about the American response. It's about how closing borders would be racist, and why Nancy Pelosi goes in the middle of Chinatown telling you to hug a Chinese person. And keep in mind that Reddit is one of the most trafficked websites in the entire world. It, of course, is going to be a cesspool of misinformation and easily, state-owned resources and agitprop. That place goes from one day, putting out Atlantic Council articles to then saying you're just putting out what the administration says overnight. So Information warfare, of course, is on both sides. Trafficked websites will always spin up divisions, adding another layer to the fog of war. Memetic warfare is incredibly real, to a point now where the German embassy has banned the Z symbol because of what's going on in Ukraine. And certain parts of Telegram are inaccessible, even on the all over the place. In part because it's harder to get access to the Russian government website. RT was banned from Twitter. From at least in certain countries, they basically cut off all access to Russian state media and what the Russians were saying, except their official government accounts. So these are things to keep in mind when we look at the future of conflict. And most conflict isn't even fought with information or with actual bullets and guns anymore. A lot of it is done by information. It's very easy to do so. And as we kind of know from Edward Bernays, as we know from Walter Lippmann, and as we know from people that work in areas like the Tavistock Institute or that work in areas of ESG, that it's very easy to have a government of media professionals and politicians, because at that point, it's a lot easier to manufacture consent. Even before what was happening in Ukraine, there were a lot of polls going around saying that, Americans, over 50% of them, are okay with defending Taiwan. So it's very easy for now information and memetics to have that sort of power here. But Vision of Confrontation, since everyone's posting Z in the chat, has the best one with YYZ. A fellow Rush fan, you have won my heart. Thank you so much. But again, social media and narratives and trusted sources, it's all there. And ESG, as John D will tell you, is an extra special kind of gay. So as we get now to the end of our discussion and lecture today, as the Internet of Things continues to evolve into potentially the Internet of Bodies, as certain individuals with WEF would like, state and non-state actors, of course, will continue to use this kind of platform and network for their own interests. We will see this all the time when people will ignore what state media has to say. Although in the United States, because we have that blurred idea of the public-private distinction, MSNBC can be regime media. You can say the same thing about actual funded state media like VOA. And there's a big reason why places like Russia have tried to advocate for other countries to kick out Voice of America and whatnot. I believe the same thing happened in Kazakhstan, if I recall correctly. But states as institutions, i.e. governments, because this is how they operate, is through a state, and primarily through its government and its institutions, have the capacity to levy the most power online through access and distribution, which is why there's been a lot of conversation as of late about DAOs, about Urbit, about decentralized networks. That way, there's no centralization that could effectively cull all aspects of your network at once. So as this evolves, there will be some more interest, I think, both from the defense side, but also in the private sector, about decentralization and decentralized networks. But the same thing will probably mean that whatever decentralization does come, that there will also be a defense aspect behind it as well. Because in a world where it's very easy to take down, centers and nodes of information, like we saw with the Office of Personnel Management, that's what it was, the OPM leak, from the Chinese hacking the US, that it becomes very easy for that kind of thing to be targeted in a central location. So why not have it decentralized in the same way that we wanted Arpanet to survive a nuclear conflict? So I do expect that we'll see more decentralization come from the side of the defense, and this area will allow for securitization to take priority in the near future. And this includes narrative control. This includes the reason why we've seen an uptick in the uptick in, what's the word I'm looking for? Fact checkers, the experts say why that's a good thing. So we're definitely moving in that direction, I think, especially in the near future. So yeah. And now that we're at the end, I think it's all time for everyone's favorite part of the stream. And I notice that the viewer count is always upticked once we get to the end, because we're all here for Frog of the Week, aren't we? So let's get started. But first, announcements. I may change the day of the stream to Saturdays, which is going to be something that I think will be good for me, at least with my schedule. I've learned that my Sundays are taking up more and more time between liturgy, the social hour, and things such as that. So I may move it to Saturday just because my day is a little lighter on Saturdays. And if I do that, I will need your help in finding an actual name for the show because I keep calling it the what's the word I'm looking for? I keep calling it the Sunday stream. And I like that because the word the in there implies that this is the authoritative place for you all to be, which you should. But it'll definitely do that. So if names and recommendations for what to call the show will also be helpful. But as Nathaniel J. Franco kind of points out, St. Basil's liturgy will do that to your Sundays. That's very true. I know that only happens 10 times a year, but nevertheless, it's something to keep in mind. But I do have another real talk in the works. There was something that that came into my mind lately. I saw this lovely meme about European forests, and it had all of the fairies and gnomes and whatnot. How it seems to be this relatively happy place, and then you have, of course, American forests about sort of these unknowns, very scary kind of deal sort of stuff. So that might be something to keep in mind. But that'll be a real talk in the future. But this week you will see my my movie review of The Man of God, which came out last year. Probably one of the best pieces of Christian media I've ever seen. Because you'll hear it in my review this week. But it was a very good film, and it does have my recommendations. And as always, my patrons on Subscribestar as well as channel memberships do have access to my the Shielding's U.S. event speech that I gave. So if you haven't bought your event book, you can just become a patron, and at the very least, you can see mine. And then, of course, I've been doing some work behind the scenes to reach out to interview some guests and have their opinions and takes on what's going on in the world. So I've been sending out some DMs hoping for the opportunity to talk about international relations with actual policy people that are experts or those that have a little more of a in the industry, so to speak, background than I do. And then, of course, there will be a book review stream this month. I plan on having Todd Lewis, Praise of Folly, Charlemagne, and Evelyn on to discuss Caleb Maupin's RedTube Serves Imperialism. And then after that, I might do a short little stream on Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-5, because one of my deacons at church had given me the book to discuss and to read. So when I finish that, I might do a short write-up for you all. But those are my announcements. There will be an update to the merch store coming next week. And your wonderful support has made all of this possible. And those are my announcements. So let's get on to the fun part, which is the Frog of the Week. Oh, no. Here we go. If the volume would play. So this week's Frog of the Week is the Wolverine frog, as you can kind of tell by its odd-looking hairy sides and thighs. It kind of has that name. It's also known as the horror frog or the hairy frog. And it is a light green, smooth skin, not necessarily warty frog. But it is known, if you can see by that little lump near the front of its little hands there, especially on what we consider the thumb, they're known for breaking their bones to create claws and to have these outgrowths in order to effectively dig, but most importantly, effectively fend off predators. The males are the ones that exclusively have these hair-like appearances on the thighs and rear. They're not bones or anything like that, but they are the same kind of hard cartilage-like material that we would know to form and create that. And those bumps are part of what makes it retractable. It's only passively because the claws and the skin eventually heals, and that's how you see the bump. So they'll break their bones again, and they'll have their claws jut out. These guys are intense. They are a terrestrial species. They are incredibly territorial, and that they're also, of course, living in Central Africa. They have to defend themselves quite clearly, hence the claws. But it is the males that are the ones that really take care of the eggs and protects them. So the absolute mad lad here, after the eggs have been, fertilized and the females are gone, they just go out of their business and they'll defend it until those eggs spawn. And they are apparently a very scary and also very aggressive species to defend. They're not only they're young near the water, but also because look at them, they're terrifying. So they're also pretty big. I mean, they're about 5 inches long in length from snout to rear. So these guys are definitely pretty big out there, ready to defend themselves. Visigoth is asking, would he trip balls if he licks them? I have no idea. When I read up on them, it does not appear that they are particularly toxic. But these guys defend their spawn. They defend their young. And the female just leaves. So I mean, they're the strong single dad after a women moment. But this, of course, is the frog of the week, and we will have more on there. A good patron of mine by the name of Lance has been putting together this Word document for me, so I don't make a mistake of repeating a frog and the difference in the future, at least. But Minoan says frogs can never be terrifying. Well, it's like that meme where it's just like the horror frog's not real; it can't hurt you. And then here's the horror frog. But this is our frog of the week, ladies and gentlemen, and that, of course, wraps up the main part and portion of our discussion today. But I will catch up with you all here and do a little bit of chilling with you all. And again, thank you to my wonderful top tier patrons that are listed up here. These guys donate $20 a month or more on Subscribestar. These guys are fantastic at keeping me afloat by making sure my out-of-pocket costs for medications and such is not ridiculously expensive, but it does allow me to enjoy everything that I do here and make sure that medication doesn't cost an arm and a leg. So you guys are fantastic, and I'm very thankful for that. But as we're all here on this cozy Sunday afternoon, how is everybody? I hope everyone's having a good afternoon, a good evening or morning, wherever you're at, whether it's Monday or still Sunday for you all. For me, it's been long. I think that's one of the issues there. I've been catching up now on the news now that I'm back. I heard that the election in Hungary went well for Orban. He had defended his majority, which is excellent news. I can just imagine that many in the EU are coping and seething as we speak, trying to offer up another $1 billion of package, offering them to democratize more. So who knows? And of course, all of my links are down in the description. As I mentioned, Subscribestar and channel memberships. You guys get access to wonderful things like game days, movie streams where we'll all watch a film together. And I've already done that several times, so I'm working on scripts for them. And yeah, there's plenty of things that are going on there. So while we're here, I'm going to just make it me so we can all just chat and talk for a while. I've also heard that the Pakistani Prime Minister has resigned and that there will be an election soon. I will be researching that lately. Of course, the 3-day rule is always in effect here because we need to understand the fallout. I don't think that this came from Russia or China to oust the prime minister. It may have been a domestic issue, especially because there is the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So there may be American influence in here as well, but we can never just throw out the agency of these states. Yes, that there are rivaling elites inside Pakistan, so we should always pay attention to what's going on there. We can't just necessarily throw out the national government and the agency of the people. Although, of course, we know that elite theory and things like those do play a role. We can't just ignore it entirely. But as I am hearing that, yes, Orban has kept his majority. I believe it's a super majority. I know that Nullus Abramancy has been doing a great stream covering the results and whatnot. So, yeah, I mean, that won't be the case. I'm hearing that apparently there was an attempt in Pakistan, or at least that there was a changing of hats within the Pakistani parliament. But again, gentlemen, ladies, gentlemen, all of you, I will be definitely doing some research and we'll cover it. But I think next Sunday, I'm probably going to have Praise of Folly on again because his discussion that we had over Mackinder, Speakman, and Brzezinski about sort of that heartland rimland theory with Russia was received very well. So we're probably going to come on and talk about Alfred T. Mahan and the discussion over the influence of sea power among nations, his seminal work and naval strategy of the time and how that still applies in the 21st century. So lots of stuff are going to come in the future. So yeah, things are doing well. Let's see here. Melthus says, you wouldn't believe how much seething and coping has happened as the people of Hungary voted wrong again, and their democracy is a threat to democracy is a thing in the EU. Yes, I'm sure that's the case. Let's see. No, lol, I don't think Todd is terrifying. I think he's just a really well-read guy. And I like that he's just able to dump a lot of information very rapidly and pull it up. Plus, the stuff that he does on his own channel is really fantastic. He's been covering the history of warfare lately, and I think he's been going through the Punic conflict, the Peloponnesian War. He's got a lot of good stuff going on. So I would like to be honest, the dream Geopol team that I would like in the future would be like Praise of Folly, myself, and Semyagog once he gets settled and taken care of with his moving. So I think that'll be something to definitely keep in mind. So yeah, I like him a lot. I would love that to be the three of us. King of Games is asking me about the politics of 5G. Well, I think that kind of lies in here with the Huawei stuff, that there was always the 5G issue between the United States and Huawei, especially during the Trump administration. That's only escalated. But again, China has more of an influence on that issue when it comes to places like Brazil. So another issue that we'll definitely have to cover in the future. But yes, no, it's been a very good Sunday. For those of you who are not within the Orthodox Church, today was the Sunday of St. John of the Ladder, and it was a very good time to reflect on prayer and discuss just the idea of the ladder of divine ascent, the famous icon that we had today in church. It was wonderful. But regardless of which, I do hope that everyone's having a good Sunday, and regardless of what your faith may be, very good time. Yes. And I think, what was it? Glow in the Dark kind of points out voting wrong indeed. I remember a line from Grey Mirror saying something like, for the cathedral, democracy really means oligarchy. Actual democracy is populism, and anything monarchical is fascism. Well, that's probably very accurate to what we're dealing with nowadays. And I think it was Compact Mag or whatever, or Table Magazine had an article about him where they had kind of done the Niccolo Machiavelli portrait, but it's with Curtis Garvin's face. And what's stopping you from having that drip? So, but as always, dear friends, what I will say is that your support is always greatly appreciated. And your questions and discussions always make me think. I had a lovely email, and I'm going to share this with you all. I'm not going to share the actual email or my inbox, but he had emailed me talking about being a storyteller. And it really kind of stuck out with me about, just someone emailing you because you have to go out of the way to just go to the About section, hit the business email tab, and just email this person. And he's just saying that he appreciated the last two posts that we've done, the Substack narrations about the being on the road or dealing with OSHA training and dealing with boomers as a younger person. He said he had found me through Yiz the Eunuch. So Yiz, if you're out there, thank you so much. I remember streaming with Yiz when I had just gotten started like a year and a half ago. So a lot of stuff has happened since then. But I'm very thankful for all of y'all. As always, I'm going to be. Whether it's 10,000 or 100,000 subs, whatever happens to this channel, you guys make it worth it. When people comment and say that, oh, I learned something, then it's all worthwhile. All of that matters to me. But that won't stop me from, of course, doing the more important stuff, which is being offline, working locally within government, trying to make sure that things are good for your community and your people. All of that matters. So you need to do all those things. So enjoy the parasocial, sure, but when the stream is ended, everything's over, you go online or you go offline and you go deal with the real world and you break bread with your neighbors and you be with your family and you call them and you talk to them and make sure that everything that you know that you can fix within your power, you do it. And that's what I will always advocate for, because that's what we have to do. Subsidiarity is a very real thing, wherein more power is done locally than it is at the national level. So yeah. Um, uh, King of Games is saying that myself, Semi-Agog, and Todd are now the Geopol Roundtable. I'd like that a lot, although I would also include Furious Pertinax, because his historical background helps a lot when helping to contextualize these things, because you can't really do this unless you have a background in history, or if you're willing to do the research on the history and consulting with people. It helps a lot. So be sure to have your background in history. Be sure that you're willing to do the reading and do the work, because you have to. But for the rest of you all on this fine Sunday, I hope that it's a fantastic one. We will have the video on the Man of God review out this week, and after this, I'm going to turn off my phone and not really be on Twitter or Telegram or anything, and I'm going to enjoy the rest of my Sunday. And I hope that you all do the same thing as well, and take care. And with that, I'll see you all next week. Be prudent, everyone, and God bless.